Hello everyone, this is Grace here from Mosman Library Service, bringing to you a free poetry workshop that you can do from the comfort of your own home. So August is National Poetry Month, and to celebrate I will be conducting a mini free poetry workshop for absolute beginners. So no prior knowledge of poetry is necessary for this workshop. All you need to do is bring a way of taking notes and an open mind and watch the video. Okay, so I will be covering what is free verse poetry, how to recognize poetic devices. We'll be doing a little bit of basic poetry analysis, and then finishing up with 3 exercises to inspire poetry and encourage mindfulness. So that's something that we all need in these uncertain times. So what is free verse poetry? Free verse poetry is a style of poetry which is often attributed to Walt Whitman, but it actually originated in France in the 1880s. It became popular in the early 20th century, and it remains probably the most popular style of poetry today. This is because it's the most creative form. It's free verse because it does not follow any specific pattern or rhyme scheme, and it doesn't follow any set length of line or stanza. There's no structure, so essentially no rules. However, it's important to remember that free verse poetry is still poetry. It's not a random set of words. It can have structure if the poet decides that they want it to have structure. It can have parts that rhyme if that's what the poet wants. It should have carefully considered word choice, and it should incorporate one or more poetic device. We'll talk more about poetic devices soon. Most importantly, what makes it free verse poetry is that it allows for creativity. So it's up to you how you structure your poem. But what separates words on a page from an actual poem is carefully considered word choice and the use of poetic devices. So what are poetic devices? I've selected a few here to discuss today. So the first example is hyperbole. Hyperbole is exaggeration, but not meant to be taken literally. Often this is used for emphasis or for the sake of demonstrating emotion or feeling, and it can be a way to incorporate humor or irony into your poem. Personification is giving human qualities to non-human things. That's quite simple, but it's really effective, as we'll see later in one of our poems today. Similes are comparisons of different things using the words like or as. And metaphor are also comparisons, but without the use of like or as. Imagery uses descriptions of senses such as smell or feel to evoke imagination and memory so that the reader can relate to or better understand the poet's feeling. And finally, alliteration is using specific words that start with the same sound, which adds a musicality to the poem. So for example, the slithering snake, or weak and weary. So to see the poetic devices in use, we're going to do some very simple poetry analysis. We're going to look at 3 poems. The first 2 are quite short, and then a slightly longer but very famous poem by Sylvia Plath. So the first poem is called Fog by Carl Sandburg. I'm going to read this now. Fog. The fog comes on little cat feet. It sits looking over harbour and city on silent haunches and then moves on. So this is a great example of metaphor and also visual imagery. We immediately have this image in our mind that is simultaneously a fog and a cat. We can imagine the shape of the fog actually morphing into the cat. By doing this, the poet introduces us to the idea that the fog is alive. It's almost personification, but he's giving the fog cat-like qualities rather than human ones. The second poem is called Risk by Anais Nin. Risk. And then the day came when the risk to remain tight in a bud was more painful than the risk it took to blossom. So Anais Nin is also using metaphor here, but in a very different way to Sandburg. It's still very clear that the bud and the blooming flower is a metaphor, but a metaphor for what or who? It's a bit more ambiguous. I like that this poem begins with the word "and." It indicates that there's a whole story prior to this statement, but there's no way to know the context, so the poem becomes universal. Anyone can read this poem and apply it to a time in their life in which they chose to grow or develop or change direction, or make a big life decision because the risk of doing so was less painful than the risk of not trying at all. We get a great visual here of a tight bud and a flower in bloom. This poem is effective and it's relatable and moving. So our third poem today is called Mirror by Sylvia Plath. This one's a little bit longer. I'll just show you. It goes over 2 slides. 1, 2. So bear with me while I read this one. Mirror. I am silver and exact. I have no preconceptions. Whatever I see, I swallow immediately, just as it is, unmisted by love or dislike. I am not cruel, only truthful, the eye of a little god, 4-cornered. Most of the time I meditate on the opposite wall. It is pink with speckles. I have looked at it so long, I think it is part of my heart, but it flickers. Faces and darkness separate us over and over. Now I am a lake. A woman bends over me, searching my reaches for what she really is. Then she turns to those liars, the candles or the moon. I see her back and reflect it faithfully. She rewards me with tears and an agitation of hands. I am important to her. She comes and goes. Each morning it is her face that replaces the darkness. In me she has drowned a young girl, and in me an old woman rises toward her day after day, like a terrible fish. Okay, so the clearest poetic device used in this poem is personification. Sylvia Plath is giving human qualities to a mirror. That's very clear. We're viewing this from the perspective of the mirror. Deeper than that, the entire poem seems to be a metaphor for time passing and aging. At first, the poem seems a little bit shallow. The woman likes to flatter herself with the lies of the candlelight or the moonlight, but the mirror reminds her of the awful reality of aging and the loss of beauty. To delve a little bit deeper again, it isn't just about aging. Let's look at it again. Why does the mirror immediately have to qualify itself as silver and exact? Again, it repeats that with truthful. I have no preconceptions. It even calls itself a little god. But a mirror is always exact. They're not. Maybe the mirror is trying to convince us that it only tells the truth. Is the mirror then a metaphor for society and the pressures put upon a woman to look a certain way? In the second stanza, Plath suddenly changes the scene from a hanging mirror on the wall to a lake. Suddenly the reflection is a lake. Maybe this is a reference to the myth of Narcissus. I've got a picture of Narcissus in the background there, which draws our attention to the parallels between his story and this one. He falls in love with his reflection, whereas the woman in this poem has the opposite feeling. This poem gives us a lot to think about. It also gives us a really great visual in that last line of a fish staring back at you in a lake instead of your reflection, which you were expecting. It's a weird and funny visual, yet it's unsettling. Some critics have suggested that the terrible fish symbolizes the woman's own self-loathing and her own perception of being unworthy of love as an old fish. This gives us an insight to the poet's mind, which we all know was quite troubled. Okay. So, now that you have some idea about poetry analysis, we're going to try 3 simple but effective exercises to inspire you on your own poetry writing journey. So the 3 exercises will help to inspire creativity. They will give you material and ideas for your poetry, but also you can use these exercises for inspiration for creative writing or writing lyrics, whatever you like. They will also help to ground you, especially the second exercise, which is called grounding exercise. And they will help to encourage mindfulness. Okay. So exercise 1, interview yourself. Now, a good place to start with writing is to look inward and to ask yourself questions which evoke memory, emotion, and feeling. You don't have to follow these exact questions, but I think these ones are a good place to start. Think about, where were you born? Is it different to where you live now? Do you have any special talents or interesting skills? Do you have any nicknames? Where did they come from? What do you like to do for fun? And what did you used to like to do for fun? Now you can think about that in terms of something quite recent. Say, for example, we're in lockdown. What do you do for fun in lockdown at home? What did you do before lockdown? Or you can compare it to being an adult compared to when you were a child. And how has your life changed? What do you miss? What's different? Okay. I recommend that you pause this video and write down the answers to one or more of these questions. You can be as detailed as you like. Just remember that you're trying to evoke memory, emotion, and feeling. So when you're ready, once you've done that, we can move on to the next exercise. Exercise 2, grounding exercise. Now this is an exercise that's actually taken from psychology. It's used as a technique to reduce anxiety, but I think it's also a great exercise for writing. The purpose of this exercise is to help you to situate yourself in a way that is mindful, but separate to productivity. It allows you to be your own timekeeper based on what you notice around you, rather than a clock or a deadline or anything causing you stress or anxiety. So the exercise is, you need to look around yourself and name 5 things that you see, 4 things that you feel, 3 things that you hear, 2 things that you smell, and 1 thing that you taste. So for example, the things that you see could be something that's on your desk or outside your window, bird flying, or the lamp on the table. The things that you can touch could be the floor beneath your feet, your hair, things like that. Something that you can hear could be a bird outside, the washing machine on, your stomach growling, maybe you're hungry. 2 things you can smell, that could be the coffee in front of you or your perfume. 1 thing that you taste could be the last thing that you ate, or maybe you have clean, fresh, minty breath. Pause this video and write down your response. And you may have listed some ideas for your subject for the poem or to use as metaphor in the poem. So when you're ready, we can move on to exercise 3. Exercise 3, metaphor maps. So this activity is essentially mind mapping. You may have come across this before. It's helpful for writer's block, and especially in this case, for coming up with metaphors. For an example, I've used the word lamp right there in the center. So this is something that I observed in my grounding exercise. It's something I could see in front of me. But rather than using the word lamp in a poem, I want to brainstorm some other words. So when I think of a lamp, I think of the light and the heat that's emitted from it. And maybe a nicer way of putting light and heat is to say a warm glow. And when I think of a warm glow, I think of the feeling of love. So now that I have warm glow, it can be used in my poem as a metaphor for love. So it's your turn, try it. Pause this video and using notes from the previous 2 exercises, spend some time brainstorming new words with this metaphor mapping exercise. Take your time, and when you're ready, we can move on to the next slide. Okay. So reflect and write. I find it helpful to free write personally. So first of all, not aiming to write a poem right away, but just to gather all these thoughts that may have come up from these exercises. So memories, thoughts, feelings, emotions, whatever's on your mind, just write. Aim to keep your pen on paper for about 5 minutes straight. So pause this video, set a timer if you like, and just free write. Once you've done that, you can actually attempt to write a free verse poem. So the subject could be yourself, or it could be an object or time itself. You can incorporate one or more of the senses described in the grounding exercise. You can attempt to use metaphor, like the first 2 poems, or personification, like the 3rd poem, or imagery, or another poetic device that we've discussed. Be creative. Once you're ready, we'll move on to the next slide. Once you have a draft written down, revise it and read it out loud. Consider the following. Does the poem have a musical quality? If not, consider your word choice. Does it evoke memory or emotion in the reader? If not, consider using more imagery. Describe the scent, describe the place, describe the feeling of the wind or the sun. Is there anything you could substitute in the poem for a metaphor? If so, try the metaphor mapping activity again. Would it help to add hyperbole or irony or humor? I find this can really help if the poem's not very interesting. When you're ready, we can move on. If you are not inspired this time, repeat the same exercises in a new environment. Isolated walks are a really great way to develop ideas. We're all in lockdown now, but we are allowed to go for our little walks. When you go for your lockdown walk, wear your mask, social distance, but enjoy the solitude. It's actually a great opportunity for self-reflection. Think about these exercises we've done today. Think about your life, your memories. Be aware of your surroundings. Notice the new flowers in bloom. What can you see, smell, hear, feel? Notice the warmth of the sun on your skin, or the cool sea breeze, or the smell of the pavement after the rain. Can you feel grass or gravel at your feet? How does it feel? I know when I step outside at the moment, fresh jasmine is in bloom, and I can smell it every time I leave the house. When you start to notice things like that, it makes the day a lot more special. All of these things can be helpful for coming up with ideas for your poetry. And if nothing else, you will come out of the exercises feeling more aware of your surroundings, more grounded. Hopefully you will notice and appreciate the beauty around you a little bit more. Okay, so one last tip that I have is to read as much as you can. If you want to write poetry, you have to read it. Write down these resources or take a screenshot to remember these resources. Thank you so much for attending today. I hope that you now have an understanding of what free verse poetry is, an understanding of poetic devices and how to use them, some idea of how to analyze poems, some writing exercises for inspiration and mindfulness, and a deeper appreciation for your surroundings. The last slide is just some references where I sourced the poetry that you read today and the images that I used. Thank you.